Hey guys, welcome back. We're about to work on Chapter 5. You might want to go ahead and make yourself a peanut butter and jelly sandwich and a glass of chocolate milk because Chapter 5 is a big one and a long one. Lots of vocabulary here, so we're going to try to take it slow and break this up into numerous pieces. The first part of Chapter 5, we're going to just discuss in general about all of the various large molecules, and then we'll break it down into the particular kinds of large molecules that we'll discuss specifically. As we work our way up, we started off with the very smallest pieces and parts, atoms, and now we're kind of building those atoms into various larger and larger molecules. And so Chapter 5 here is the last chapter of things we're going to discuss before we get to actual life. From Chapter 6 on, we're discussing cells and then up to organisms. So this would be the last chapter that is basically made up of smaller things that we wouldn't consider alive. And in Chapter 5, we're going to talk about the structure and function of these very large biological molecules that make up you and me and everything that we eat. So we've got a bit of an overview here just to get us started. All living things are made up really of only 4 classes or categories of these large biological molecules. And you've probably heard of them before. Carbohydrates, and that would be like starches and sugars that we're going to discuss. Lipids, that would be some of the various fats and steroids. Proteins, which are what make up meat and muscle and that type of thing. And then nucleic acids. And nucleic acids are important. We're going to find out that's what your DNA, your various genetic instruction code is made up of, and we'll discuss that at the end. In general, you would call these macromolecules. These macromolecules are very large molecules composed of thousands of connected atoms, usually covalently bonded together. And the 3 of the 4 here that would be considered macromolecules are the carbohydrates, the proteins, and the nucleic acids. We're going to find out that the lipids, which are primarily the fats and oils, are not usually quite as large and complicated, so we wouldn't necessarily call them macromolecules, but they do fit into this category of important large molecules. And then down at the bottom it says molecular structure and function are inseparable. Again and again we come back to this big idea of form and function, and it's going to be very important here when we talk about these large molecules, particularly when we talk about the proteins. You'll see how the shape and the three-dimensional form of the protein is just as important as what makes it up, as the elements that make up the protein. So here we're talking about molecules that are made up of thousands of atoms, and some of these molecules have a mass that's over 100,000 daltons or 100,000 atomic mass units. So that tells you about the size of these molecules, comparatively speaking. And the structure, the way that they are built, and the way, particularly in proteins, the way that they fold and bend and shape themselves into particular shapes are very important, and they give these large molecules emergent properties. So again, there's that idea of emergent properties, how you see certain characteristics that only show up at certain levels of organization. So the properties of the atoms that make up the protein are different from the properties of the large, full protein itself. When we get to talking about the proteins again, we'll talk about how important this 3D shape here is. As a matter of fact, the shape of the molecule is so important, just as important as its chemical makeup. Here you see some scientists who are working with these large macromolecules, and generally when they're doing this type of work it's with the proteins. But you can see she's wearing like 3D glasses, and she's staring at the screen there, and she's actually trying to determine, or she's studying the 3-dimensional shape of this particular large molecule. There's even a game online, and if you look in the notes for the PowerPoint or the PDF, it's called Foldit, F-O-L-D.it, Foldit. It's actually an online game where you can learn about protein folding, and you can actually, through the playing of this game, it's kind of a crowdsourced game where you have thousands of people around the world playing. You're actually helping scientists better understand this folding of these large molecules and their 3-dimensional shape. And you do that just by playing this game. And the hope is that eventually, with this game, they're actually going to be doing research that is applicable to the various science fields. Alright, so let's get started. We got Concept 5.1, macromolecules, which again is just a name for these very large molecules we're talking about, are polymers built from monomers. So we're going to see these words over and over and over again. It doesn't matter if we're talking about the nucleic acids or the proteins or the carbohydrates in particular. All of these are macromolecules, and they're all polymers. And polymers are basically long chains of molecules, and they generally are repeating patterns of similar kind of like building blocks. So consider these polymers as long chains, and then the monomer is like a single link within that chain. And just like in a chain, like down here in this picture, these links are basically the same, just repeating patterns. You see that a lot also in these large molecules. So you have little units called monomers, and they're made up of certain atoms, and then those monomers repeat and are linked together to form these long, huge, very complex molecules, these long chains called polymers. And so of the four categories that we're going to look at of these organic molecules, three of them are like this. Carbohydrates, proteins, nucleic acids, they are all what we would call polymers. Now, even in the fats, you're going to find out that there's a repeating pattern, but most of the lipids, I should say, the lipids, which are fats and oils, they are large molecules and they have repeating patterns, but they're generally not as large and as long, so they're not often thought of in the same category as these three. So polymer, you're going to see monomer and polymer in all three of these categories. Just as an FYI, a lot of times it helps when you're studying all this science vocabulary to understand your suffix and prefixes, that type of thing. Poly, of course, means many or numerous, and mono, of course, means single or one. Inside our body and inside the bodies of all living creatures, you have a couple of different chemical reactions going on with these long chains, these polymers. And at some points you have these chains being broken apart, and at sometimes you have these chains being built and made longer or more complicated. So the first type of reaction we're going to look at is a dehydration reaction. And based on the name, you can kind of probably figure out what's going on here. A dehydration reaction builds the polymer, makes the chain longer, and it does that when two monomers bond together, and we're going to find out when that bond occurs, a water molecule is produced and released. So through the loss of a water molecule, H2O, you're going to see this bond occur. So it's called a dehydration reaction because a water molecule is produced and then lost or given off kind of as a byproduct. So dehydration builds the chain, makes the chain longer, adds on more links to the chain. Now the opposite of that is called hydrolysis, and that's when the chains are broken apart, when a link is taken off or somehow the molecule is broken down into smaller parts. We call that hydrolysis, and it's basically the complete opposite, where a water molecule is broken into the H2O portion and added. And when that happens, that breaks this bond apart, and that water molecule then becomes part of the two separate pieces. So hydrolysis is adding water, adding a water molecule, and in the process breaking this long chain of polymers into smaller pieces. So dehydration builds the chain, makes it longer. Hydrolysis breaks the chain and makes it into smaller pieces. And what's used inside living organisms is what's called enzymes. And we're going to hear that word again, enzymes. Enzymes either help to break the chain or build the chain. And enzymes are kind of like tools. So if you go out to a shop or a woodworking shop, you're going to have all sorts of tools. You're going to have hammers and drills and saws. And these tools, they help you get the job done quicker, faster, better. And that's what enzymes do for chemical reactions. They help that process along and make it move faster. So we'll talk more about enzymes just a little bit later. How about a good example of one of these? Hydrolysis, for example. A great example of hydrolysis within our own bodies is food digestion. You know you have to have food, you have to eat, and that's where you get your energy source, but you also have to have water. Well, we don't necessarily get energy from the water itself, so why is it so important that we have the water? Well, if you look at that definition of hydrolysis, now you understand. Those water molecules are needed to break these long food chain polymers apart so that our body can use them and then take those smaller pieces and rebuild our own skin, muscle, bone, etc. So the water is needed so that we can do hydrolysis within our own bodies, break that food into its smaller parts so that the body can use it. And then the enzymes within our stomach and our digestive system, they break the polymers apart using that water into what we would call smaller polymers, or even the monomers. And then those are small enough that they can be absorbed into the blood and then absorbed by our cells and used to live, to do what it takes to keep those cells alive. Here we have a basic animation. Of course, you won't be able to see it in this view, but if you right-click and hit play in the PowerPoint view, or if you look on the PDF view, you should have the ability to play this little animation, and it talks about how monomers are put together to build polymers. And this is true no matter if it's a carbohydrate or a protein or nucleic acid. Monomers are the links. Put them together and you create a polymer chain. So here's just a quick picture in case you didn't watch the video or can't see the video. Up at the top here we have a polymer, a short polymer, and then there's a separate little monomer. So this is like a short chain, and then here's an additional link. And we're going to add this link to the chain. You see the link ends with an HO, and this link ends with an H. Well, when they are put together, you have a dehydration reaction that occurs. Water is released, and then that becomes bonded together. So basically what's occurring here is we are adding a link to the chain, and this is a dehydration reaction. Now the opposite of that would be breaking that bond apart. So here we have a fairly long chain of polymer, and what happens is water is used to help break this connection between the 3 and 4 right here. So you can see a water molecule goes in, it's broken apart, one of the H's goes here, one of the HO's goes here. So now this particular link is broken off of the chain and can be used as an energy source or for other purposes for the body to build more parts that it needs. So this would be the opposite. This is breaking the chain, and that's called hydrolysis. Now the cool thing is the diversity of all these polymers. Each of these polymers can be very large and very complex, and each of your cells within a human body or any living creature has thousands of these different large macromolecules. And the macromolecules can be different ones based on which cell we're talking about. So the macromolecules within a skin cell may differ from the macromolecules within a muscle cell. And then you have even more variety if you're comparing different species. Like, say, you have more variety if you're comparing one human to another, and then even more variety if you go out beyond the species. Like if you compare a frog to a human or an oak tree to a fish, you'll have even greater variety. But the cool thing is you have this enormous amount of variety, but they're all built, we're going to find out, from a fairly narrow set of blocks or monomers. And it's kind of like thinking about a set of Legos. So if you have a set of Lego bricks, like 50 mixed Lego bricks, well, think about how many different combinations you can make. You can make far more than 50 separate things. You can make hundreds, thousands, millions of possible combinations just using those 50 bricks. Or think about the 26 letters in the alphabet. Well, with 26 letters, how many different combinations? How many words? And then with those words, how many different combinations of words? How many novels or books or plays can be written? All just using those 26 letters. So you can see how starting with just a few basic building blocks can end up with a huge variety, and that's what you see in living creatures. We start with these monomers, and then they're put together in a variety of ways to build all these large macromolecules. Okay, we're going to take a break right there. We're going to try to chop this up into short pieces because this is a heavy, heavy chapter. So if you didn't do it already, go make that peanut butter and jelly sandwich, grab that glass of chocolate milk, come back and see me in just a few minutes.